This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and the role of China internationally is very significant. Economically, it's one of the largest exporters of capital in the world. And we wanted to talk today, the reflection of that in South Africa and Southern Africa. And with us is Patrick Bond. He's professor at the University of Johannessburg in sociology. He's a political economist, and he has some extensive research that he's done on the role of China investment in Southern Africa. So welcome to our show, Patrick.
It's great to be with you, and anybody connected to the Pacifica Network, I'm delighted to be reconnecting to, because back in 1989, that was my main home when I was based in Washington, PFW and Pacific. I was a national economics correspondent, so I feel right back at home again.
Great. So first of all, I mean, China during the struggle against apartheid did play a role. In fact, one of the things that they did, they were supporting UNITA in Southern Africa, and that was an earlier period, of course. But why did they support UNITA, and what did that mean to South Africa?
Right. Well, just generally, the Sino-Soviet split from the early 60s meant that there were favorites. So that on the one hand, China was much closer to something called a Pan-Africanist Congress here in South Africa. And there were indeed some very big divisions around the region, one of which was UNITA in Angola, which ended up being part and parcel of the Reagan regime's destabilization with the apartheid regime. So UNITA with Jonas Savimbi went in a very right-wing way, although they had some neo-Maoist origins. But also China supported ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, whereas the old Soviet Union had supported the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, and ZANU kind of won there by roughly 80-20 in the 1980 elections. So there was very uneven. I mean, in Mozambique next door to us, the Russian connection was more decisive. But I think when we look back at that period, from the 50s through the mid 90s, it's less relevant today, even though China and Russia are back together, and we'll be hosting here in South Africa BRICS and what's called the BRICS Plus. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But in August, we anticipate a variety of relatively tyrannical and carbon-intensive countries to kind of join in, which would include even Saudi Arabia and Iran, now back together thanks to Chinese diplomacy, as well as Afghanistan and UAE and Algeria and China and Egypt and Senegal, Nigeria, Indonesia, Thailand, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and Argentina and Nigeria and Nicaragua, if I've got them all in my head here. But basically, this is a moment for us to really think about whether the West is being properly challenged by an anti-imperialist force, which is going to be, I think, known as BRICS Plus, or some combination of the existing Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and its new members that will be signing on in the next year, on the one hand, and the imperialist West on the other. Is the BRICS Plus network the potential anti-imperialism, or is it a sub-imperialism? And we're asking that question to kind of give you the big picture context that we see from this side.
And of course, the development of China and its growth has an important effect on the world economy. And joining the WTO, they were able to get access to South African markets. So what effect did China joining the WTO, World Trade Organization, have on the South African economy?
Well, a devastating de-industrialization, that's fairly obvious, no one can deny. But in fact, the process had begun roughly a decade earlier, from the early 1990s, when the apartheid regime here in South Africa was under sanctions, and President Mandela from 1994, but he'd been released in 1990. So gradually there was a liberalization, and the agenda of white capital, not just the kind of white racist state, but the white capitalists, was to begin to break away from the let's say the sort of lager or the constrictions of being in a rogue regime that was under sanctions by popular forces. Not so much, eventually the US government in 1986, but essentially it was a kind of popular movements. And in 1985, that had led to a debt crisis. And so we see this process of opening that eventually led to China's de-industrialization of South Africa through importing cheap manufactured goods, because, the huge economies of scale. Even I was just picking up a little plastic bottle of toothpicks that you kind of use to clean your teeth, and suddenly I see made in China, and I'm realizing we don't even have toothpick production here in South Africa anymore. And so it's that process that had liberalized from the early 90s after sanctions were lifted, but also that then President Mandela, whom I work for as his first policy drafter, he felt that the balance of forces were such that liberalization, that opening up the markets and letting in imports was appropriate. So actually, we immediately lost in the mid-90s clothing, textiles, appliances, electronics, leather. I mean, our basic labor-intensive industry. Partly we lost because the old-fashioned manufacturing systems and older equipment, were replaced, but also because geographically the center of gravity for the world factory shifted to the east coast of China, but via places like Bangladesh and Pakistan and India. But East Asia and Asia in general has really been doing the manufacturing, as in the US, as in many places, at much cheaper rates without much attention to labor rights or to environmental and safety and health conditions.
And this deindustrialization in South Africa, I know that I was in Cape Town, which had a large garment industry, and you had a situation where a large number of garment factories were closed down. What was the effect on the trade union movement as a result of deindustrialization?
I mean, I hate to admit it because I'm quite closely associated with the left of the union movement, with the South African Federation of Trade Unions, but its predecessor through COSATU and before that FOSATU, so these other predecessor unions, regrettably had white technical advisors, guys like myself, who decided from the mid-1980s that instead of promoting class struggle, they'd promote a class snuggle. That is to say, they'd figure out how the flexible specialization and post-Fordist regimes of accumulation, their phraseology drawn from the French, would allow for a variety of new techniques, such as the just-in-time production systems, or the quality circles and team concept, or ways in which that the sort of mechanization processes could be socially controlled through strong union influence. So they were looking for a kind of corporatism that, instead of developing a socialist project, really fit into the changing world capitalist system. They failed miserably in developing their own, let's say, a South African version of a sort of a strategy. Yeah, the US was doing it too, right, with the labor movement, moving into corporate boardrooms and adopting many of the sort of new technologies of post-Fordism. So we had a terrible time in which key labor leaders, I can mention them, I mean, some of them were white guys like Alec Irwin, who became the Minister of Trade, or a man I work for, Jay Naidu, who was the Minister of Reconstruction and Development. And they were basically co-opted from a very militant trade union force, COSATU, in the early 90s, into the ANC, and then into government, and then into the highest levels of, let's say, neoliberal compromise. Some of them, like Jay Naidu, have come back, but I know Alec Irwin still thinks what he did was correct because of the balance of forces. So what we're saying is, the Soviet Union had collapsed. That sort of vision of a let's say, a Stalinist historical trajectory of African nationalism suddenly without the confidence, and as a result, neoliberal processes were imposed. And the trade union movement, as much as several of the kind of key affiliates and leaders and some of the mass movement, every year there was a big strike they did fight back, but it wasn't strong enough. And now we're in a situation where, regrettably, even worse balance of forces have emerged because of splits within the left of the union movement, with the metal workers especially, single biggest union, deciding that its old traditions of eco-socialism and of sort of the left sovereignty now can be replaced by promotion of coal and coal-fired power plants and the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa network, and even a pretty open promotion of Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine. Now, what I'm describing is miserable. It's a situation where the labor movement hasn't come to grips yet with the potentials for a genuine just transition and a red-green project, aside from a few of the forces within SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions. I would mention their General Secretary, Zwelinzima Vavi, in one of the unions, the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa, GEWUSA. But I must say, we're in a very, very tricky situation because 10 hours of the day, we don't have electricity on many of the days this year, what we call stage 5 load shedding. And in addition, this relentless attack of austerity from the neoliberal forces within the ruling party, within the sort of capitalist bloc, and the crucial finance ministry and reserve bank have really led to tremendous misery. So even on the 20th of March, we're anticipating some sort of national shutdown attempt. It may not go very far. It's coming from one of the left parties, which is the Economic Freedom Fighters and the South African Federation of Trade Unions. But it's kind of a reflection of just how I think the masses really are in a position where they have to fight back. And yet much of the work that's happening along those lines has been rather atomistic and secular, sort of secularized within NGOs or single issue movements. So we're pregnant with the potential for overcoming these conditions, but the broad terrain isn't yet particularly favorable. And that's where the Chinese come in, because they typically will promise that the productive forces, the machinery, will be provided, the infrastructure, the forces of production will be advanced by Chinese capitalism.
And BRICS was presented as a alternative to U.S. capitalist, U.S. imperialism, that this would be a way of developing the country's resources, that China would make investments through BRICS to basically advance technology, advance industrial basin, and the Zuma government, now Ramaphosa, support that. What were their promises and what were the actual results of this BRICS investment in South Africa and Southern Africa?
Well, in fact, it's really been the Chinese above all, although there's been a little bit of Indian investment and a little bit of Brazilian, especially in Mozambique and Angola, a little bit of Russian here and there. But the real promise, Stephen, has been the attempt to pose an alternative world order in which, according to the kind of rhetoric, as you put it, we're going to see some challenge to the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank, World Trade Organization, United Nations, especially its economic arms, and its climate arms, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's been the rhetoric, because the North has too much power, because of unequal exchange, the uneven development, the unequal ecological exchange. The South is being looted. And that's the rhetoric, that the BRICS are like the non-aligned movement from Bandung, right, in the 50s, or from the struggles of national liberation movements against colonialism in the 60s, here, especially in Africa, or from struggles to generate revolutionary new international economic order, visions from the 70s. Those all failed, and you're absolutely right. From the 2010s, the new vision has been that the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa nexus would come up. So I've watched this fairly carefully. I've edited a couple of books, and we've come to a theme called sub-imperialism from a Brazilian, Rui Mauro Marini. Now, the work of Marini, David Harvey as well, who's my PhD supervisor, and a few others point to not the anti-imperial resistance, but rather the assimilation of these countries into the very multilateral institutions I mentioned. And I could go into any number of details about them, because in every one of those venues, you really hope that the BRICS, or that some force, at one point it was a pink tide of, Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, Evo Morales in that first wave of the pink tide, maybe a second wave coming up with Lula now elected to Brazil's presidency. But frankly, none of it has ever materialized. The one institution that has come out of all of those promises of something new and different is called the BRICS New Development Bank, the NDB. Now, this NDB was meant to be the alternative to the World Bank, but it frankly isn't. And every bit of its portfolio is full of dubious loans and corruption. If I look at things like the WTO, when Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa's president, and Narendra Modi from India tried to get the intellectual property exemption of the waiver on COVID-19 medicines and treatment from 2020 to last June, they failed. And no surprise that China, with its vaccine, and Russia with its, just didn't support. It was really, I have to blame, the Brits, the Germans, the Norwegians, the Swiss. Those are the ones who stopped the multilateral, let's say, public good potential. But then I go to the UNFCCC, and you can look at this climate summit again and again. You find that the BRICS line up very tightly with the West to prevent the emissions cuts, and especially climate debt, right? The reparations for the loss and damage. I mean, just last week we had roughly 600 people dead in a big cyclone Freddy that came through, started in Australia, the biggest cyclone in terms of its aggregate energy ever recorded. And so we're going to see many more of these. We had 500 killed in a city I lived in, Durban, last year, which was because of a massive rain bomb, again, climate related. And what we find is that the BRICS line up tightly with the West to refuse climate debt. In other words, not to pay the loss and damages or the adaptation costs, or to compensate poor countries for not emitting, say, greenhouse gas, industrialization, or fossil fuel development. Now, that whole set of arguments for the climate justice movement is pretty logical. So when BRICS countries, especially South Africa in 2011, host this UNFCCC, we will typically see these kind of protests. And now that the UAE is hosting the COP28 in December this year, and will be probably part of this BRICS, but also it's, as I said, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Algeria, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, massive carbon-intensive autocracies. We're going to see quite a contradiction between the talk left of the BRICS, the walk right, or the sometimes, you kind of get a talk green, but actually walk dirty. So I wouldn't really trust any of the rhetoric that we've seen. There's been only one or two vague instances where the BRICS have not acted in a sub-imperial way. And one of those, of course, is Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine in a sort of rogue sub-imperial expansion, the sense that in that particular geographical area, Putin wants to restore the old Soviet Eastern Europe hegemony. But I think this is the dilemma, isn't it, for us? When we look at the world and we don't like Washington or Moscow, we don't like, the way Beijing's operating, and particularly I can go into any number of details about the quite adverse experiences of Chinese investments here.
Well, why don't we do that? Because, I mean, there's both public and private investment of BRICS. So why don't you talk about some of your example or studies of specifically how it's affected South Africa?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to start just by remembering the promise from China, because we had from about 60 years ago, Zhou Enlai made a visit here. It was in 1963-4 to several countries. He was in Tanzania and Zambia, and that's one of the great projects of the Chinese in that era, which was the Tanzam Railroad from Dar es Salaam, the port, to Lusaka in Zambia. So that sort of solidaristic investment is what we want. Can I just give you quickly 8 points with the Zhou Enlai, the then premier, said he'd make sure that China engaged in mutual benefit, no conditions, no interest or low interest loans would not create a debt burden. Help the recipient nation develop its economy. Don't create dependency on China. Help the recipient country with projects that need less capital and quick returns. The aid in kind must be of high quality at world market price to ensure the technology can be learned and mastered by locals. And eighth, the Chinese experts and technicians working for the aid recipient countries are treated equally with the local ones with no extra benefits. Now, those 8 points, the principles that China had promised, have been utterly violated, Steve. So I can go through a few examples, but I think the bottom line is, the causality. Why is China so different today than it was in 1963 with the Tanzam Railroad as a kind of, metaphor of really good solidaristic investment? So I would say first and foremost, my understanding of Chinese political economy from visiting and working with many Chinese Marxists is that there is a problem of the overaccumulation of capital. They've basically taken the Western model of highly capital-intensive industrialization and export and taken it to the extremes where there's huge overcapacity. And that can be measured typically by more than a third idle capacity in most of the heavy industries. I can get into the details, but the main point is that led to the going out, right? The overaccumulation meant that there was a spatial fix or geographical push from Chinese capital. And Africa is part of that Belt and Road Initiative that has been the main vehicle for that. Shall I give you a few examples?
Yes.
So, for example, our single worst case of Chinese going out here in South Africa is the worst case of corruption ever, which is the Eskom, that's our electricity company's coal-fired power plants, in which especially Chinese financing was involved. And so the China Development Bank made big loans, and the loans just have gone into corruption. I mean, it's interesting that the corruption is Western. It's Hitachi from Tokyo, and it involved bribery of the ruling party through its main investment arm. It was, in fact, prosecuted 8 years ago in Washington at the Securities and Exchange Commission using the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and Hitachi paid a fine. But we're still paying the China Development Bank for these awful loans for coal-fired power plants. By the way, Steve, it's a 4,800 megawatt coal-fired power plant. It doesn't work. It's called Kusile. There's a similar one, Medupi, that the World Bank invested in with China going along. The second is the Transnet, that's the state rail company, and their purchase of locomotives mainly for exporting coal. And China became a major coal purchaser again. And there again, massive Chinese corruption in the China South Rail locomotive provision. And that's about $5 billion worth of contracts, again, financed by the China Development Bank. A third, Steve, is the Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone. That's in the north of the country, massive sort of steel and iron ore and other heavy industrial facilities that were supposed to be powered by a coal-fired power plant, but social resistance has stopped that. But that's about 10 billion. Just to give you a flavor, again, I've mentioned corruption already twice. Here's the third one. Interpol wanted the guy called Ning Yat-hui, who's organizing this huge, big complex he was actually red listed for his corruption next door in Zimbabwe, and yet South Africa's trade and industry minister just allowed him to have it. I could go on. I mean, probably your viewers are interested in the auto industry because we have First Auto Works and Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation, two of the biggest Chinese car companies that moved to South Africa, but they didn't really move a full industrial production system, even though South Africa is a major auto industry and kind of well integrated, right from the iron and steel and aluminum and even the leather seats are done here very, very well. But instead, what both those two Chinese companies brought in was a knockdown kit approach. So lots of labor unrest in a place called Kucha over this special economic zone with very low interest rates. A fifth one is a big construction company called CCCC, forgot what it means, but anyway, it's trying to build a big set of bridges on a toll road to facilitate mining. Major corruption associated with that company, one of China's biggest construction companies, and so contestation. Just a few more. There's, I think, a broader problem, which is China is the middleman in the global value chains for minerals and especially fossil fuels. But any non-renewable resource that comes from Africa, I can tell you, I mean, even the World Bank says 88% would be non-compensated at the level that is required for what economists call the Hartwick rule, that is reinvestment. What I'm saying is China has taken over from the imperialist system, which had taken multinationals into Africa to mine and to loot the continent and not repay that depleted wealth from non-renewable resources. So it was Western firms, but now it's Chinese that have kind of taken over and then send the end product to the West. To me, that's one of the most insulting processes of Chinese rhetoric of development, because if they're still going with the old Western idea of GDP, gross domestic product, what it means is that they will count the exports of, say, platinum or iron or gold or coal that are four main exports from South Africa to China. And they'll say, well, South Africa is getting good GDP. But actually, when you deplete the minerals and you do a full cost accounting, the wealth actually gives us a net negative outcome. And that comes back to the point I made earlier, which is that just like the West used to do, starting, with slavery and then, settler colonial and then imperial and neoliberal extraction systems, China does that. But then when they send the imported goods manufactured, it de-industrializes. So here we had 25% manufacturing to GDP at the end of apartheid. Now it's 12%. That's mainly Chinese imports. There's also the Chinese debt I've mentioned. And then I've got to say that there's the sub-imperial role that the Chinese delegates play in the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, UNFCCC, UN Security Council. And then as a final point, I'll just mention that I've been very angry about the way this rhetoric of Chinese socialism or Chinese solidaristic investment occurs here. But it's even worse in the region. So just a couple of examples, the Zimbabwe diamonds, the biggest diamond field since Kimberley, were looted by a Chinese company, Anjin, in alliance with Zimbabwean generals. Also in Zimbabwe, there's a place called Wangi, where they have massive coal and just terrible Dickensian conditions there. If you go up one country from Zimbabwe to Zambia, the Copperbelt mines. If you got a little bit further north, from Uganda to Tanzania, there's a big Total Energy, French pipeline that China is participating in. If you go to the west, to Angola, you find corruption. Go a little bit further south, uranium mining in Namibia, especially the Rossing uranium by Chinese firms, hotly contested by workers, terribly exploitative. And maybe the worst to come is China National Petroleum in Mozambique to our east, which is the biggest oil and gas field in Africa. And they're just getting in now. It's a blood methane situation, like blood diamonds of Zimbabwe, in which the Chinese are part of what we saw last week, Cyclone Freddy, the heating of a Mozambique channel where massive gas is being extracted from. But in return, we get not only cyclones that are as devastating, hundreds killed the last few days, but also create the conditions for an Islamic guerrilla rebellion. It's called Al-Shabaab, and they've killed 6,000, and there are 1 million displaced people. And that in turn has meant that South Africa's army is there, black bodies supporting white capital, which is Total, with the Chinese as a sub-imperial ally of Total, ExxonMobil, and Eni, the Italian company. What I'm trying to get at, Steve, is a ghastly phenomenon in which Western exploitative capital is the vanguard, but China is locked right in.
And there have been strikes, I know, in Port Elizabeth area of a Chinese truck assembly plant, where the Chinese did not want to be part of the Employers Association. They had a substandard contract with the NUMSA workers. And it seems that when Chinese companies come in, they undercut actually Western imperialist investors. Is that true?
Indeed, it's surreal, because with all this rhetoric of developmental Chinese investment, that particular place, the Kucha Special Economic Zone in Port Elizabeth, or it's now just been renamed Pravecha, that is one of the exemplary cases where the metal workers most at risk, because particularly robotics are being used in knockdown kits. So all of the interlinkages we'd want to see to have a sort of value chain that really takes South African capacities seriously. And don't forget, this is the same city that Henry Ford set up in 1917, right, 106 years ago, Africa's first auto plant. So it's a strong tradition and a great labor tradition. And so the Chinese have very much undermined labor with capital-intensive knockdown kits aimed at having a made in South Africa, actually to tap into the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act from the United States, which gives some sort of privileges for South African exports to the US. So I could go on and on about the ways in which these, let's say, micro insults to developmental potential exist. And the dilemma is, while we have a very strong metal worker movement, some of the ideology and the ideologues around it actually line up pro-China without openly confronting these contradictions. As I said from the outset, Steve, I would love the rhetoric of China, especially Zhou Enlai's 8 principles. I would, as a developmental economist, to be able to say that China is achieving any of those 8 principles would warm my heart. I just can't find it. And all the rhetoric by even some of the smartest people, I think, that are working out there. I'm thinking of someone like Vijay Prashad, who was in Johannesburg last June, really promoting the Chinese cause. It just doesn't hold up.
And the issue of privatization, one of the things that the IMF World Bank did with Mandela is to, I think, have a plan to privatize the economy and to provide shares to union leaders. I mean, people ask, why did the union leadership of South Africa, of these militant trade unions, flip? And one of the things that has happened is they became shareholders. Ramaphosa is an example of companies, and they were integrated into the capitalist class. But the privatization of the economy of South Africa, the destructive force of that in transportation and power, is there a correlation between this method of integrating the union leadership, supporting privatization, and then the tremendous crisis now where you can't even get regular power in South Africa? I mean, because of the privatization of Eskom and other companies.
Well, that's absolutely right. There are several components, and one, the most critical, is what you put your finger on, which is because Eskom didn't adopt renewable energy, even though we've got the greatest sun and wind and some stored energy potential. We even have tidal and wave potentials in the future. This could be a fantastic vanguard of a genuine just transition and an eco-socialist energy transformation. However, unfortunately, government, particularly where Cyril Ramaphosa was concerned as a former coal mine owner, and that coal mine that he worked with Glencore's leader, very, very corrupt company, very corrupt man, Ivan Glassenberg, to supply Eskom, meant that Eskom was very addicted, and still is, to coal. And so what they want to do is a transition via methane gas, and including the blood methane. But what it means is that when they do solar, they don't take it on as Eskom, a huge parastatal company that could be absolutely world leading in taking advantage of this tremendous potential here in South Africa. Instead, they've farmed it out as independent power producers. Now, some of the labor movement went along with these privatization processes. They especially went along where there were opportunities for their investment companies. And that was one of the corrupting forces, by all accounts, that the South African trade union movement got shares called Black Economic Empowerment, or B shares, And as you say, Cyril Ramaphosa was the key figure in that from 1996, when he'd finished writing the Constitution, which has a very strong property rights clause. He then moved into business, and that strategy of ensuring that about a quarter of each white-owned company could be transferred through debt financing to Black pseudo-ownership as the economy privatized and as procurement contracts organized through the Black connections to the ruling party. We've got, as a result, an absolute meltdown of the productive forces because they're all been sort of hollowed out, or as we say, white-anted, the white ants in the sense of this corrupt process. So, for example, even the Treasury Department, the finance ministry here, has admitted that of every procurement contract, on average, you'd get 35% overcharging. And that I would put down to this Black economic empowerment working hand in glove with white capital. And I have to mention, Steve, that we think of the corruption in the country sometimes overly emphasizing the state, the Black-run state, but actually they rank, according to Transparency International, as the 110th most corrupt state of 180. You can check the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. But the corporates in this country, according to PwC is a very corrupt company. I don't think I'm going to be sued if I say that, because PricewaterhouseCoopers has many, many cases, including with our own airline, of just being absolutely scandalizingly destructive in terms of its own corruption. I trust them when they measure world corruption, and they do that every couple of years with the economic crime and fraud index. And so South Africa during the 2010s, here in our capital of capital, in fact, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange here is the world's leading stock market for the capitalization to GDP, but we have ranked number one as a site of corporate corruption, of economic crime and fraud. And there's a whole set of criteria that go into that PwC measures. And so it's a measure of, I think, the extent to which someone like Cyril Ramaphosa himself was corrupted. So he was the sort of key guy for Lonmin. And the most important labor event since the end of apartheid was when Ramaphosa emailed to the labor minister, to the mining minister, to the police minister, that the striking mine workers in a place called Marikana, about 2 hours to the west of where I am, Marikana, where Lonmin, one of the big London platinum companies, was based, and they were on strike because they were getting less than $1,000 a month, and they wanted more than 1,000, just over 1,000, and they were shot down 24 hours after those emails from Cyril Ramaphosa that said, "Don't treat this as a labor matter." He said this is dastardly criminal. They need a, quote, pointed response, concomitant action. So what we're looking at, Steve, isn't just that labor through its investment companies have bought into privatization, that labor through the National Economic Development Labor Council, which is a sort of tripartite body, has bought into corporatism, AFL-CIO type, big business, big government, big labor, corporatism, or we call it the class snuggle instead of the class struggle. But in addition, we've had politicians that labor has supported, including the sort of center left labor movement, COSATU. They've supported Cyril Ramaphosa even after he was very clearly responsible for calling in a massacre that killed those 34 mine workers on August 16, 2012, 24 hours after Ramaphosa's emails. It's a pretty, inconceivable situation where Ramaphosa had once been the mine worker leader in 1987, who called for a national strike of the mines against white capital and really damaged the apartheid and capitalist confluence at that point. And that's the trajectory of so many of our elites. They become unpatriotic. Ramaphosa taking massive amounts of money abroad through his Shanduka, according to the Paradise Papers, through Lonmin, through MTN, the big cell phone company. And in addition, then treating workers with more and more of the classic kind of outsourcing and all the techniques of 21st century super exploitation.
And of course, one of the things about privatization, the destruction of the labor movement, is contract labor. And I know that in Namibia, it's come back with these companies, private and public companies, taking investments and then trying to push out regular workers who have seniority and union contracts to contract labor. Is contract labor growing in South Africa, and you have mass unemployment? I mean, how has the effect of these policies affected the working class of South Africa, the poor?
Yes, it's been a terrible situation, probably as bad as anywhere in the world. Don't forget that the city, the most unequal, the country, the most unequal, has much worsened since the end of apartheid, partly because co-optation of some of the labor leaders to become, maybe they were, militant shop steward. Well, the company boss approaches them and says, look, we really don't want to hire any of you and your workers, but if you set up a company, we'll hire your company and then you supply the labor. So that's the outsourcing that has become quite common across all the industries. And it affected where I work, which is a university, so profoundly that in 2015, university students found that they had an incredible alliance. It was so heartwarming, Steve, because the lowest paid workers, who were the cleaners, right, the janitors, the security workers, they got together with the militant students who couldn't pay their bills. And they said, we want a student labor alliance, that fees must fall and that the workers be insourced. Now, that's the main case we've won in opposition to what I've just said, which is the tendency to outsource. And we'd add to that, of course, all the techniques of artificial intelligence and what we call the fourth industrial revolution, all of the ways in which labor is being undermined through new technologies. And yet, at one point, at least 2015, 16, workers and students together won. So those workers are now back in my university as fully fledged. In fact, they tripled their wages and have good bargaining conditions at the moment. What we need to see is that occurring across the whole economy, well, indeed, across the whole world. And I think it's a good reflection that again and again, South Africans will surprise, because when the deterioration of living standards, or when the insult to human dignity, or when the penetration of capital, privatization goes too far, South Africans are often the cutting edge. So I mentioned that the fight back on students to get free education was successful. Most students, working class students, do get tertiary education. I know your U.S. listeners and viewers are going to say, what the hell? How'd they do that? Because we can't even get Joe Biden to keep the promise of canceling the debt and giving us free community college. But secondly, our activists won, supported by the trade union movement, free AIDS medicine. So don't forget, we have about 7 million out of 60 million residents here, people living with HIV, but they were dying every day massively, to the point where life expectancy went from 64 during apartheid to 52 in the early 2000s. Well, because they fought for free generic medicines supplied through the government and defeated in the WTO Big Pharma and the Bush regime, and even South Africa's own genocidaire Mbeki government, that free medicine policy now has raised life expectancy back to 65 just before COVID. We had about 300,000 deaths in COVID, so obviously a dip. But I mean, it's that sense that whether it's free education, free AIDS medicines, or free water and electricity, one of the major struggle sites at the moment, and winning again and again at the shop floor level. We do have a very militant working class. The World Economic Forum, Steve, during the 2010s would regularly measure in the Global Economic Competitiveness Report the militancy of workers. And so South Africa did definitely win more years than any other. I think Trinidad and Tobago was the last winning team, because they have such a militant oil industry workforce. But it is a wonderful sense that even in the conditions of the worst inequality, the worst corruption, the sellout by the African National Congress, even Nelson Mandela himself, and yet labor, even as split as it is across all sorts of sites of division, working with communities and environmentalists and social movements, really can again and again surprise the rest of the world and continue, to need and perhaps to give solidarity, even in the U.S. labor movement. A last point on that is that 50 years ago, Steve, the Durban dock workers went on strike, and they sparked the modern labor movement. It was January, February, March 1973. And a bunch of the longshoremen from Oakland came to Durban to celebrate that. I think there were about a dozen of the guys who came out. And they blew every South African's mind, and vice versa. And it's that spirit, I think, of keeping those memories alive and renewing them with new forms of solidarity that we're all looking for.
And the argument of the South African Communist Party was that you would bring democracy in South Africa, and that would lead to socialism as the second stage. It seems that, in fact, there is no democracy really in South Africa, with the corruption and the kind of collapse of society and the system, and the ravageness of capitalism. So it seems like this idea of a two-stage theory to socialism has been basically shown to be incorrect. Is that true?
I wouldn't quite go so far. I've been teaching that this very week with my master's in social theory class. And we go back to what we call the articulation of modes of production, where capitalism pounds you, but not just through exploitation at the point of production, through apartheid, through the gender-related, right, the patriarchy that fits in, because men are reproduced as workers by women who aren't given any support when they're in the rural areas, and the men come into the cities. I happened to spend this afternoon with Brazilian comrades walking through our Johannesburg Workers Museum. Wonderful place. I hope all of your viewers can come and see it. And just to see those hostels, right? The 16 men lying in one room in beds, very uncomfortable, very, just appalling conditions. And that was the 20th century. And that articulation led, as you say, to a sense that we've got to get rid of the apartheid system. And we'll have a two-stage revolution in which, once we've done that, we go for socialism. And the dilemma is that the Communist Party has become, pretty much embedded deep within the neoliberal states. I can name any number of communists, including a current general secretary, or the last general secretary, chairperson. I mean, top people. Even I would say Joe Slovo, who adopted. He was kind of the greatest old communist leader coming into the democratic era. And as a housing minister, he adopted World Bank policies that led to complete, chaos in the housing system. I go into any number of details, and I debate it with my old friends in the Communist Party. But it really is a reflection of the limits of that third internationalism, of a sort of Stalinist tradition in which you tie your future so much to the nationalist project, the African, and then they become corrupt and neoliberal. Frantz Fanon laid it out so well in these various warnings, like The Wretched of the Earth. But the communists have got a ladder, as do many of the centrist trade unionists in COSATU, from their current positions into very high-ranking, sort of ministries in the state. And even though the neoliberals really control the state, they're very good at divide and conquer, and they give a few tokenistic positions to communists. So our Communist Party is, as a result, they have a claimed membership of 350,000, but I think it's quite a farcical movement. We have a great tradition here called talk left, walk right, and it kind of keeps the
I think it happens in the United States. It happens in many countries.
Here you've got a
South Africa is not unique.
Yeah.
So how do you see the future?
We're talking, Steve, at the moment where a national shutdown is being called by a populist left party, which has more, right-wing populist tendencies, I fear, than left, called the Economic Freedom Fighters, because what I fear is that they're trying to get rid of Ramaphosa, which they may succeed in within the next year, and that's an election next year. The next president is likely to be a man called Paul Mashatile, and this left party, I'm going to say advisedly, the EFF, is actually doing deals with the ANC at the municipal and metro level.
Didn't they keep the ANC in power with an alliance with the ANC in Johannesburg?
That's correct, and not just Joburg, the capital city, Pretoria, our next door neighbor metro, Ekurhuleni, Durban is in place. It may also occur in other metros, and so that's the real dilemma, that the traditions of sort of radical nationalist populism tend to become quite conservative when it boils down to the real crunch, and that is the alliance to get power and to get access to those contracts, the patronage system, the tenderpreneurship, the entrepreneurs who do tender state procurement contracts. So that might happen because the ANC is, by all accounts, going to slip below that 50% popularity level. They would win elections without any question above 60% until a couple of years ago. And what I expect now is that the economic freedom fighters will join them. But there is still potential. I'm always kind of optimism of the will with the pessimism of the intellect. And the optimism of the will may be that we can see a revival of left trade unionism and the social movement anger, and especially the youth. And they are out in the streets again, even at my own university and others, out fighting for their own economic self-interest. It's when the fragments of all these different sectoral groups, whether they be, communists and trade unionists and Greens and feminists and the youth and NGOs and sort of social movement components, to come together in some sort of united front. And there have been moves in that direction, but they've faltered, partly because of some, relatively, I'd say, uninformed or, sort of self-interested leadership from especially metalworker unions. That we've seen some terrible disappointments on that front. But on the other hand, the conditions are so ripe for revolution, even if the subjective conditions in which our consciousness and our organizational forms are not ready. The objective conditions, the terrible cost of living crisis, the massive unemployment, the effect of COVID, the debt crisis, and the austerity that we're feeling, it does create one of the most extreme sites of uneven and combined development, as I sort of say technically. Not kind of a Trotskyist, but it works as an analysis of South Africa today. But it does
And the role of the United States in South Africa is not well known, but the CIA, with the support of the AFL-CIO, helped fund King Buthelezi, and Inkatha killed thousands of trade unionist workers and their families in South Africa. Is that well known at this point in South Africa, that political intervention, financial intervention?
Well, yes, certainly the AFL-CIO and Solidarity, it's sort of operative wing here, much distrusted by those who went through that period of the 80s in which Gatsha Buthelezi, who had his own little fake union movement, opposed sanctions, and then the more, let's say, left forces and unions came around to sanctions. But I would go back even to the CIA helping the South African government to arrest Nelson Mandela, which was in 1962, I think it was, when he was pretending to be a chauffeur of a car, and CIA tipped off the South African police. But look, the main thing is that the Yankees now have a material interest in keeping South Africa away from a Russian connection, which we'll see, let's say, formalize in August at the BRICS when they expand BRICS and bring in more of Russia's allies. But interestingly, just last week, Russia sent one of its most advanced ships, along with a couple of Chinese ships, to do military exercises with South Africa offshore Durban, the main port. And there were protests, and I think not just the kind of liberals and the Ukrainian exiles, but progressive forces were out saying, hey, this has gone too far. And I think that might be one of the most interesting dilemmas. There's certainly a wonderful consciousness about the way the United States, under especially Ronald Reagan, to some extent Bush sided with apartheid. But there's also reminders that the nostalgia that many would have, that at one point the Soviet Union was so risque you couldn't even talk about it in public here, and that support that Soviet Union gave to certain parts of the ANC now doesn't stand up to the damage that Vladimir Putin's invasion has done. That damage, by the way, Steve, is in energy markets, it's in food markets, but it's also in the sense that the ruling party itself is funded by one of the oligarchs. And in March 1 last year, sort of 4 or 5 days after the invasion, suddenly a big chunk of money, which was sort of $700,000 to keep the ANC afloat, the African National Congress needed that, and they got it from a guy called Victor Vekselberg, very close to Putin. And so we kind of have this awful, let me call it a vulgar Marxist temptation. Okay, I'm a vulgar Marxist some days, but we have a temptation to say, well, maybe the Russians have really bought the ANC in a way that Western multinational capital, Shell or its allies here, have also tried to do. But when the Russians do it, they're probably a little more sophisticated in really making sure that what happened on February 25th, which was South Africa's foreign ministry, opposed the invasion and said to Putin, get the troops out. But by March 1, right after that contribution had reversed its position, said, we're going to be neutral. So I think that's the main problem for Washington. And we saw Tony Blinken come here in August. We saw Janet Yellen come here in January. We saw President Ramaphosa visit Biden in September, and then our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, go to the big Africa summit in December in Washington. So we're seeing a lot of connectivities, but lots of dialectical tensions as well. I'm not sure how it'll play out, but South Africa has often been the most conservative force in, let's say, opposing the West, the very tight connections. But something happened a couple of weeks ago, which is called gray listing, in which the failure to regulate illicit financial flows, drug-related terrorist financing, all these kind of, sort of messes in our financial regulatory system attracted the sanctions from the Financial Action Task Force, from the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund. What it means, Steve, is that we're like South Sudan in terms of our banking system. If you want to send me a couple of bucks, I can give it to some trade unions. We're going to have a hard time because we're now gray listed. So that's one of the dilemmas that I personally feel, okay, some financial criminals are going to have a harder time taking massive amounts of loot out of South Africa. About 7% of our GDP evaporates through illicit financial flows, according to Treasury, every year. And so gray listing, to me, is actually maybe useful, because our forces, our progressive movements, our trade unions, some of our NGOs that work on this have not been able to put on tighter exchange controls or enforce existing regulations. So now South Africa, according to US standards, is not fit for international financial intercourse. We have some sort of Slim's disease that'll require some sort of condom. Maybe that's appropriate. And I think that's the dilemma for our left movements here. There's a tendency towards a nationalism that will defend even the most corrupt bureaucratic, let's say the corporate bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeois bureaucratic class against the West. And yet at another level, so I'd sort of be sympathetic to that, because the West is the main enemy of progressive people. But on the other hand, our own forces are so utterly decadent and corrupt, these corporate and state forces. We may actually need the West to put some sanctions on. It's a terrible dilemma, isn't it? But that's where we are.
And the role of Royce Singham, who's an American radical who has been intervening in South Africa, has he played a significant role in some of the political developments in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, the big controversy with Royce Singham, the former ThoughtWorks co-founder, who had so much money and spread it, to extremely good groups all across the African continent, using a little base north of Johannesburg, as well as groups like the Movement of Landless Workers, the MST in Brazil, and various forces that Roy and Vijay Prashad at the Tricontinental, and extremely impressive people have been able to rally huge social movements around. Abishali Basim Jandolo, another example, the shack dwellers. But when it comes down to the ideology, it's been really opaque, and it led to the crash of a major e-zine, right? One of our sort of very respectable left journalistic outlets called New Frame last June, July, and that in turn kicked off some investigations, and it in turn created a lot of, let's say, dust in the air. I would, for example, look at my dear friends at Monthly Review and say, well, they may have made quite a mistake by publishing some of Roy Singham's allies' material. And if you're looking at the ideological orientation, it could be, in a very vulgar way, described as the campist or tanky or, kind of pro-Chinese and maybe even pro-Putin links. And I would put the metalworkers, who very openly came out pro-Putin about a year ago and saying, why can't Ramaphosa get the BRICS to help Putin? Right out kind of campism on the one hand. And on the other, we've got probably too much of a counter reaction. We're trying to figure out if there's any middle ground. I'd be certainly one of the people most associated with, let's find Ukrainian solidaristic relationships. Let's find Russian left solidaristic relationships. I'm always searching for those. We have a BRICS from below that every year since 2013, protests or counter summits or attempts to do something to say neither Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. But Roy Singham does still have a lot of clout and financial support and support for groups, and I would include the metalworkers, the biggest union, over 300,000 members. And when their leaders say, well, we support coal and we support Putin and we support BRICS, then you kind of wonder, what kind of degeneration have we seen in ideology, particularly with Roy Singham's money flushing in here and making quite a mess, I'd have to conclude.
And I mean, they call their union a democratic centralist union. They're a communist union. What is that all about? I mean, the idea that this union of 300,000 members is a Bolshevik type organization, is that true?
Well, once I got to teach the union leaders Das Kapital, it was 1997, including the current General Secretary, Irvin Jim. Brilliant folks there, really militant, but they have had a tradition in that, let's call it Eastern Cape Communist Party, where many of them had emanated from, that I think led to some bad habits, and those included the kind of classic manipulative approach. And what, for example, they did last June was, I think, unforgivable. They just simply purged from their union one big province and 53 of their key leaders. One of them was the president of the broader union movement, SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, Ruth Nkosi. And Ruth Nkosi is one of the real stars of this movement, but she was simply purged. So there's a real problem with the way Irvin Jim's taken NUMSA into this, let's say, lager. And I'm not sure, because it's all in the courts and he's won a few battles recently, I'm not sure how it'll pan out. Certainly is the biggest union in the South African Federation of Trade Unions, not paying dues on time, all the kind of, predictable sort of techniques if you're, trying to undermine a broader independent left unionism from that tradition of Irvin Jim's. Well, there's still a lot of capacity to do a lot of damage. What it's meant is that the South African Federation of Trade Unions, in a couple of days on Monday, the 20th of March, will actually be trying to have unity to shut down the country as a way to say to President Ramaphosa, get out of here, move, the way they did to Jacob Zuma in 2017. He did then have to basically resign within a few months after that big upsurge of protests in early 2017. By December 2017, he was finished, and he was pushed out in February 2018. And that's the hope by, I think, various of the progressive forces, including this economic freedom fighters. What comes next, though, will absolutely require the unity of our trade unions, and maybe that SAFTU, COSATU progressives. Don't forget that the COSATU, the main centrist union, about 1.4 million members, versus SAFTU with 600,000. But COSATU's most powerful wing is in the teachers and the nurses. Those two big unions have the largest chunk of members. And the nurses have been on strike the last week, but they've been doing such militant tactics that they've kind of alienated many in society. You can imagine many deaths in the hospitals after the nurses, and yet their cause is just, which is that they've been underpaid for years, since at least 2020. Negative real wages because of the austerity, even during the COVID crisis. Now, all of this represents a terrible set of fragmentation and interests, and some of the unions having been quite corrupted. Whether we can very quickly come out of this, and maybe something that'll signal for the society on the 20th of March, is whether some sort of, if not effective, alliance between Labour and the EFF, but something that might shut down the economy, at least Monday, for a sort of stay-away day. Tuesday is a big holiday of Human Rights Day. It may send the kind of signal that, okay, we've been exploiting these workers and the society just too much. It's time to make some concessions.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with Patrick Bond. He's a professor at University of Johannessburg in sociology, and he has been studying the role of China in South Africa, Southern Africa, and of course, the international implications of this. It's not just a South African story, it's an international story. So thanks for joining us on Workweek.
Great to be with you, Stephen, and more power. We have two words that we always transmit from this side of the world. Amandla.
Very good. Okay.
Power to the people.